You are liable to get whiplash from all of the twists and turns in oil strategy involving the war. Wait, the Ukraine war or the Iran war, you might ask? To which I answer, yes. But today we will be mostly focused on the situation in Ukraine. You see, this week, Ukraine unleashed multiple massive attacks on some distant oil infrastructure. The corresponding explosions have disabled about 40% of Russia's export capacity, effectively reversing the gains that Russia hoped to make from the Iran war constricting crude supply. It is a big moment in the overall conflict, and it deserves a closer look. But let's rewind, because it is important to understand how many times Ukraine has changed its precise oil infrastructure strategy, and why it has made those changes. You have probably watched this time-lapse a few times before on this channel. It tracks Ukraine's broader energy infrastructure campaign since the middle of last year. And if you can hold off on blinking for a few seconds, you will see that the bulk of these targets are oil refineries. Apologies that the tracker stops at the end of 2025, but Maduro and the Ayatollah diverted my attention. Suffice it to say that the overall campaign has continued, and evolved. At the start of the campaign, refineries were the right target. They sit at the top of the oil value chain. Crude is worth less than proper petrol. So if you destroy the refined products, then all of the labor and capital used to get to that point are effectively wasted. It did not hurt that the refineries are relatively soft targets. Imagine tanks upon tanks of highly flammable liquids just sitting there out in the open, waiting for someone to light a match. Well, that type of opportunity was exactly what Ukraine wanted to find in the early phases of its long-range drone program. No need to figure out how to get a large warhead on a drone. Just bring a light explosion, and Russia's own stuff will do the rest. The strategy eventually shifted after the CIA discovered a particular part of the refineries that Russia would struggle to repair. Ukraine could aim for it rather than the fuel tanks to multiply the effect of each strike. All the while, the United States was helping to plan the path that the drones would take to their target sites. U.S. intelligence could also much better see how Russia was aligning its defenses on any given night, and so Ukraine could learn how to avoid them. The White House was okay with this because it effectively removes supply from the global market. The United States being a net exporter, this would more or less be an economic wash for the country. Gas prices might go up, yes, but the difference was not necessarily discernible to consumers. Hold that thought for later. You know, it will not surprise you to find out that gas prices are dominating the news cycle right now, potentially costing Americans more than the value of their tax refunds, and with even the Postal Service adding a fuel surcharge to package deliveries. Never mind what the Iran war is doing to international markets. But thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, we can highlight something that was easy to miss. Over on their blind spot feed, I discovered this story about the United States easing sanctions on Belarus to mitigate the effects of fertilizer shortages, a less discussed aspect of the Hormuz shutdown. There was relatively little coverage of this story on the right. And I can also ensure that I am getting a broader perspective by toggling whether I look at the international feed or something more tailored to my location. Moreover, by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take an excellent 40% off a Vantage plan to gain access to all of these features and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. That takes us to the second phase of Ukraine's strategy. With Russia's oil refineries down, the Kremlin needed a plan on what to do with the excess crude that its wells kept pumping up. Naturally, the solution was to ship that crude abroad. However, exporting the excess was easier said than done. The global tanker market was not set up for the post-2022 system. Russia previously exported to Europe, involving relatively short trips for the tankers involved. Now those tankers were having to travel to India or China. And if we look at a map, those countries are indeed further away. They then somehow became yet further away, at least for the tankers that did not want to brave the Houthis along the Bab el-Mandab Strait and instead sail around Africa. Oh, and to make matters worse, some of the supply coming from the Middle East that was previously going to China was now having to head to Europe. And yeah, that also got worse following the Houthi thing. To keep all of this supply running at the same shipping rates as before, you would need to suddenly have more tankers appear. But that is not a magic trick that the world has available to it. Sure, you might be able to convince a marginal tanker to hold off on getting repairs for just one more trip, but you are not going to truly resolve the supply problem. Thus, if Ukraine could disable a Shadow Fleet tanker, it would not only strand the specific oil on the tanker at the time, it would also effectively strand all of the oil sitting at the port waiting for it, trip after trip. Another Shadow Fleet tanker was not about to take its place. Even better, if you did not want to upset your coalition partners with oil spills every 2 weeks, you could destroy empty tankers. The oil gets stranded at the port one way or another. The only challenge was to hit moving targets that tend to be naturally well shielded at often far-flung distances. It would have been helpful here if, say, Europe had simply enforced sanctions and safety regulations on Shadow Fleet tankers. We know in retrospect that Russia has not done anything significant in response to such measures. It therefore makes sense for Ukraine to specialize in the relatively escalatory action of bombing the Russian homeland, while Europe specializes in the very European thing known as enforcing international law. In any case, I would describe this second phase as a modest success for Ukraine, but it did not bring about the same results as the refinery campaign that continued on during this time. That takes us to the tail end of 2025, when American adventurism began altering the security environment. The United States began to impose a de facto quarantine on Venezuela. No more oil leaving the country. For once, there was a supply shock increasing tanker availability. Most captains did not want to go near the Venezuelan coast, because the United States was very much enforcing the policy. Fans of a certain Mexican food were perplexed, but it was what it was. Targeting tankers was still valuable in the aftermath, just not as valuable. The bottleneck was no longer there. The tanker itself might be valuable, and it would send a message to other captains, but it would not keep the Kremlin from finding another tanker to fill its place. However, the Caribbean quarantine was just the warm-up. Fast forwarding into the new year, and right past the special Maduro operation, the United States launched an air war against Iran on February 28th. Shortly thereafter, Iran de facto closed the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone has focused on the soaring gas prices as a consequence of the closure, but there is something more subtle happening on the logistical side of things. Yes, there have been some tankers stuck inside the Gulf for weeks now, but there are yet more tankers that dare not go into the Gulf and are therefore looking for something else to do, like, say, go pick up some oil from Russia. It remains sensible to disable Russian Shadow Fleet tankers when the opportunity avails itself. It remains sensible for European countries to enforce their own regulations on Shadow Fleet tankers. But if you are a strategic planner in Kyiv, it no longer makes sense to have a laser focus on tanker targets. And that takes us to the events of this past week. It appears that Ukraine has shifted focus yet again. Now the crosshairs rest over Russia's oil export terminals. To be clear, this is not entirely new. Export terminals briefly blinked on that timeline from the beginning of the video. But hitting ports along the Baltic Sea is a challenge, given the distances involved. And because the export terminals are harder to make go boom, you might want to have a larger explosive on board the drones that you send over there. That is a bad combination, lest we forget from the Diego Garcia incident that the way you send a projectile further is by shrinking its warhead. The math of payloads aside, think about why we have arrived at this evolution. There is now a glut of oil, and there is now a glut of tankers. What there is not a glut of, and what is also not easy to expand, is the number of export terminals that Russia has. Destroy those, and you still destroy the entire ecosystem. Well, let me start with the standard fog of war caveat. Some of the precise details of the story here vary based on the source, but something like the following happened. On March 22nd, Ukraine sent a giant drone wave over to the Primorsk oil terminal up along the Baltic Sea. The strikes aimed toward the terminal's berths, also igniting a couple of tankers that were loading at the time. Primorsk's normal exports of 1 million barrels per day are now just accumulating on land. And yet, that was just the warm-up. On March 25th, Ukraine sent its largest drone wave of the year, thus far, to the neighboring Ust-Luga terminal, with maybe some double-tapping Primorsk. The result was yet more suspended operations, perhaps because the Ust-Luga rail system had been severed. There may also be tankers on fire sitting at the berths. Either way, another 700,000 barrels per day were removed from the board. Then, just to make sure that everything would remain a mess, Ukraine struck Ust-Luga again on March 27th. Fog aside, what we can be confident about is that the fires there continue, meaning that one way or another, the oil shipments are not happening at the time of this writing. Bear in mind, though, that a lot of money is at stake here, so Russia will restart exports the moment that it is feasible. For now, let's do some quick math. Primorsk and Ust-Luga combine to account for 40% of Russia's oil exports, meaning that Russia now only retains 60% of its export capacity. Using West Texas Intermediate as the benchmark, 60% of $94.73 comes out to $56.84. By comparison, pre-Iran war, West Texas Intermediate sold for $67.02. In other words, these attacks have more than countered the effect of Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. To be clear, this is not an exact figure. Russian oil is not priced the same way as West Texas Intermediate is. Russian oil does broadly follow global prices because of basic market forces, though, and we can more clearly observe changes to West Texas Intermediate prices. Thus, the percentage comparison is fair, and it is favorable to Ukraine. To be clear on another dimension, this does not make the Strait situation any better from Ukraine's perspective. What would be yet better for Ukraine is if the Iran war was not happening, oil still sold for $67 per barrel, and Ukraine had disabled Russia's Baltic terminals. Zooming out, the terminal attacks raise two important questions. First, one wonders whether the United States assisted with intelligence for this operation. The Trump administration is no longer keen on doing anything at all that elevates gas prices. Heck, we have seen waivers on secondary sanctions for countries importing Russian oil and Iranian oil. So helping here would represent a significant inconsistency in White House policy. Either that, or someone at the CIA or elsewhere just told Ukraine the information anyway, having not explicitly been told not to. Ain't no rule that says you can't give Ukraine intelligence. And there have been reports indicating that the intelligence community is much more interested in helping Ukraine than the White House is. In any case, it is good news for Ukraine. Either the intelligence is still flowing, or Ukraine is capable of executing these strikes on its own. The other question is whether the operation is sustainable. Russia probably will not be down 40% capacity forever. It would not surprise me that some portion is back up and running by the time that you listen to this. And in terms of trying to undo Russia's repairs, if oil terminals are the new key target for Ukraine, you would imagine that Russia will reassign its defenses accordingly. Oddly, that may involve putting more air defense inside of Belarus, as one of Ukraine's two flight paths appears to have spent substantial time over Russia's Union State partner. Ukraine's drones did not have a perfect execution of this attack. Two went off course, one appearing to have clipped a tree in a wooded area of Latvia and then crashing without incident. It is rare to see genuine photos like these, but what you are looking at now came straight from the Latvian Defense Ministry. The other off-course drone hit the chimney of an Estonian power plant, but otherwise did not cause any damage. Learning and iterating are key to changing the headline from 40% currently offline to 40% offline, period. Keep that in the back of your mind. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? Ukraine has adapted its energy infrastructure campaign as the war evolves. Currently, the export terminals are Russia's weak point. Ukraine has temporarily taken 40% of that capacity offline, which more than offsets the economic gain from the Hormuz closure. But the work for Ukraine is not done. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan. As for me, that marks 28 consecutive days in the books. I think adult responsibilities are going to get the best of me next week, but this has been an interesting streak while it lasted. Check out some of my other videos to keep the party going. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.